Thanks, Peter. Well, lovely to be back. Many of you were here, I think, yesterday. Some weren't, I'm aware. So let me just take a minute to summarize some of the things I said yesterday and move us on to this next scale of analysis in this talk that I've called Species, which are going to focus on animals. So the Huxleys, we've learned, were trustees of evolution. They carried forward over the 19th and 20th century this great matter of how the world is to understand evolution by natural selection. And yesterday I proposed that we might learn more, perhaps most, from these Huxleys if we reimagine them as cosmologists, as philosophers of life, actually as philosophers of life, as much as zoologists, biologists, scientists of life. Because it's clear that they, certainly T.H. from the 1840s as quite a young man, was trying to chart and map ways of understanding all knowledge, all matter, all space, all time. So they had a kind of cosmological inclination that evolutionary theory began to change and underwrite, and that was carried forward for Julian Huxley here well into the 20th century and connected up with his politics of global internationalism, the idea of world unity, and certainly his politics of world government. He was very much of that generation. And I indicated yesterday that what has been a great challenge and pleasure, of course, for all of us is how to structure our large projects. And what I've decided to do, experimentally at least in these lectures, we'll see how it turns out for the book, is to think in terms, downwards in terms of scale of the work of these extremely expansive and connecting thinkers. So from the cosmos, we are moving down to species, with a little bit of discussion in this lecture about Homo sapiens, a very particular object of inquiry for the Huxleys, but today setting mainly humans aside and focusing on the questions of animal species of all kinds for these Huxleys. Can you hear at the back perfectly well? Thank you. Now we know that one of these Huxley core intellectual missions really was to place humankind in nature, evidence as to man's place in nature, T.H. Huxley's famous early 1860s book. And we know also that a lot of historians have worked over the Huxleys and the question of human politics. But in truth, T.H. Huxley spent probably much more time thinking about other kinds of animals, often of great antiquity. And Julian Huxley, for his part, was by training an animal and bird observer before he was anything else. Dead and alive animals were everything to the Huxleys, from T.H.'s research on marine invertebrates to Julian's famous great crested grebe, or at least if this was an audience of zoologists, he would be famous for his work on the great crested grebe. More on that later in the talk. Animals were everything to them, from orangutans and chimpanzees in the 1860s that T.H. Huxley discovered in books and sometimes as skeletons, to Monkey Hill at Julian's London Zoo in the 1930s. The Huxleys had a long involvement with creatures domestic, zoological, stuffed, fossilised and wild. Between them, T.H. and Julian embodied and enacted to some extent the modern shift in animal research and also animal ethics from classic quintessential imperial natural history in T.H.'s case, the great moment, if we can call it that, of natural history collection, to high modern conservation in Julian's case. They cover this range of generations from vivisection and anti-vivisection to humane societies, from the study of comparative structures, in TH's case, to the interactions of animal ecology and ethology, animal behaviour, in Julian's case. So in my effort, as I said yesterday, I've taken my cue in thinking about the Huxleys rather less from the obvious and correct domain of thinking with respect to them, which is the history of science, and rather more from the Wiles lectures itself, the history of civilization. And so I've tried in my rethinking of the Huxley story to, in a way, not just tell the history of science story. So in choosing to spend an hour talking about species, I want not to retell a story about the history or historiography of especially TH's particular involvement in the technical question of species, and instead talk about animals more broadly and animal politics with respect to the Huxleys, including, and I'll end the lecture with this, T.H. Huxley's invention of the term the man family. So let's begin with the Huxley animal story, and it begins indeed with the rattlesnake, with the HMS Rattlesnake journey. T.H. Huxley's very prolific and productive, and sometimes for him very painful journey, more on that on Saturday, to the east coast of Australia, and most importantly in terms of natural history terms, to the southern part of what is now Papua New Guinea, and especially here the Louisiade archipelago. This was a journey he took between 1846 and 1850, and he was an assistant surgeon, but his journals and his letters, and there are many of them, detail very little at all, actually, about mariners' health or ill health. And he would seem really to have sailed more as an assistant natural historian alongside naturalist John McGillivray rather than assistant surgeon. It was observational, natural history-oriented travel, as we know, from Cook's journeys to Charles Darwin's own journey, von Humboldt's journey, Wallace's journey. These were the natural history journeys that produced evidence for a new global biogeography, and ultimately for a new theory on the origin of species differentiation and an entirely new science of life eventually. For T.H. Huxley, the rattlesnake journey enabled the study of species quite new to him, of course, and he received very significant accolades for this work, gaining a precocious fellowship of the Royal Society from it. But it was through animal physiology and to some extent anatomy, but mainly animal physiology, that T.H. Huxley entered the philosophical discussion of animal sensibility. And in this respect, he followed very explicitly and very directly, and sometimes arguing quite violently, with Descartes, whose work on animals as automata was physiologically as well as philosophically argued. So Descartes insisted on the machine nature of brutes. He insisted and argued that humans had a consciousness and that animals did not. T.H. Huxley argued from an evolutionary base that animals, rather, are, he said, at the very least, conscious machines. He said a strong trait-like consciousness could not just appear de novo in one species, humans, without some form of it, some remnant form of it being foreshadowed more or less dimly in earlier species. He said animals have a form of consciousness that foreshadows those feelings which we possess ourselves. So this kind of argument was by no means peculiar to T.H. Huxley. It was, as many of you will know, a very lively mid-Victorian debate, and one that T.H. engaged in for decades, this whole question of animal consciousness. And he did so very much in constant is overstating it, in conversation, I would say, with philosopher Herbert Spencer. So Spencer derived, for example, human justice from what he called subhuman justice, on the same evolutionary principle through which Huxley had earlier argued for animal consciousness. They agreed, for example, that justice becomes more pronounced as organizations of a species become higher or more complex. And they agreed also that sensibilities varied within species, not least with purposeful breeding. And interestingly, on the history of civilization, in this work on animal consciousness, it's quite common for T.H. Huxley and many of his contemporaries to talk about breeds of dogs as more or less civilized. And so, for example, Huxley at one point said that a particular breed of hunting dog is civilized because its sinuses had been bred in a particular way, and compared to wild dogs, this indicates a civilization of the dog. So Huxley and Spencer were putting evolutionary and physiological twists not just on Cartesian philosophy of animals as machines, but also, of course, on far older scriptural debates about whether or not animals have souls and whether those souls were immortal. They were offering secular and scientific postulata on animal emotion, feeling, and language. And this was part of a larger and much longer scholarly context for Darwin's own work on the expression of the emotions in animal and man. All of them, in a way, were engaging in a rich, in many ways unsurprising, Victorian discussion about animal consciousness. For T.H. Huxley, animals occupied actually a very strange in-between ground. On the one hand, I discussed this partly last night, they were thoroughly objectified. They were dead, they were fossilized, they were preserved around him in Kensington. And primarily they held structural anatomical interest for him. On the other hand, his very keen interest on the physiology of nervous systems in particular opened up an inquiry into sensation, into feeling, and that led to questions about the discussion of emotion and even of memory and consciousness in animals. These were fascinating physiologies as well as philosophies for T.H. Huxley, although, as I said, perhaps unremarkable for his generation. Across scientific and non-scientific domains alike, a common enough mid and even late Victorian inclination actually was to feel for and even with other organisms, other animals. T.H. Huxley never did so as acutely as Charles Darwin. Even for him as a physiologist, that is to say T.H. Huxley as a physiologist, the very study of feeling and of sensation across multiple species was compelling. For his generation, and partly for himself, accessing the domain of sensation and emotion meant that human-animal connection was actually in this period often opened up as a possibility rather than shut down, which is sometimes what we receive from historical work in tracking human interest in animals and animal consciousness. There is often a received idea that somehow the Victorians were more distant and that over the 20th century a kind of a relationship with animals emerged. But in fact, I think it's possibly the reverse. For T.H. Huxley's, and even for someone as kind of distant as T.H. Huxley himself, the whole question was about constantly asking questions about the nature of human-animal connection and human-animal similarity by virtue of animal consciousness. Julian Huxley and perhaps his generation were far less interested in the philosophical crossovers between humans and animals as at the level of souls or emotions or sensibilities or consciousness. I think they were far more interested in species as ecological actors with each other. In this way, and perhaps counterintuitively, animals were more separated from humans for Julian Huxley in the 20th century than for his grandfather in the 19th. So even as Julian repeatedly stated the continuity and the connection between all cosmological elements, as we heard yesterday, he also conceptualized animals within their own domain, within another domain to humans, in a way that I think was actually quite different to the Victorian desire to draw and work out the connectedness between animals and humans. Julian Huxley was far more interested in animals, as we see here, the great crests relating to each other in their own habitat. He early practiced a field method that firmly distinguished himself as human subject observer from animal as object of observation and analysis. And again, one of Julian's very influential and best known zoological works does remain the article 1914 called The Courtship Habits of the Great Crested Grebe. It remains a classic. An ethologist, he was much more interested in any possible emotional relationship between the male and female bird than the question of how animal consciousness and sensibility related to human versions of it. Well, Julian Huxley, for his efforts and perhaps for his dynastic reputation, was appointed Secretary of the Zoological Society of London in 1935. And working as the chief of zoological gardens and zoological research, perhaps seems to run counter to his inclination that field-based observations, especially of birds, were the primary kind of zoology to be undertaken. But actually, Julian Huxley was very keen to reform the zoo, to reform its organisational philosophy, and he put a lot of effort, ultimately unsuccessfully, arguably, but he put a lot of effort into aligning the zoo with very recent developments in ecological sciences. So instead of descriptions and classifications and boards marking species-oriented, a classificatory model of the zoo, the kind of organisation that actually exercised his grandfather, and that in fact still governed the logic in the Natural History Museum, Julian Huxley wanted to display and communicate concepts and processes in zoology like adaptation, like protective coloration, for example, the idea of niche and the idea of sexual selection. So he wanted to reorganize the zoo and its displays and its interpretive signage to reflect the new biology. Well, the difference between T.H. Huxley's Natural History Museum and Julian Huxley's aspirational London Zoo was quite clear, and one measure of the shift between 19th and 20th century naturalists' conceptions of human-animal relations. T.H. tended towards the description of dead animals, as I discussed yesterday. Julian sought in the London Zoo not just a menagerie of live ones, but the materialization of a philosophy of their relation to generic biological principles and new biological principles. And this, the historian of Joe Cain argues, is in fact why he was fired fairly quickly in 1942. Julian, in fact, had a run, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow evening, of fairly short-lived appointments. In his later life, it was not Regent's Park, but parks in Africa that provided Julian Huxley the context in which to serve as ecological responsible trustee to animals. the new word, conservation of African wildlife in situ, became his really major project, especially after the Second World War. Africa as a whole was very important to Julian, who made multiple return visits in any number of capacities over his lifetime to Southern Africa, to Eastern Africa, and to Central Africa, including especially the Congo, where the guerrillas were. And this made these return visits, and he was always, in the same way as in the image at the London Zoo, here, you see Julian Huxley as the H.G. Wells communicator in another medium. So many images of Julian Huxley have the means of communication in front of him. Here he is with multiple radio stations broadcasting. He never missed he was an extraordinary publicist, and not just a self-publicist, although he was good at that. And so in a way, the London Zoo did very well out of him because he was always, here he is opening the new pets corner with the chimpanzee down your bottom left, is that your bottom right? But Julian Huxley was, yesterday I said it's useful to think of Julian Huxley as an earlier David Attenborough, and we see him here in that kind of action. With all of his Africa trips, Julian Huxley never missed an opportunity to write articles, to present radio programs, and to write endless, quite short, very good-selling books about his experiences. His first trip to Africa was 1929. His last was as a quite elderly man in 1971. Wildlife conservation was this new idea that Julian embraced and did really a very great deal internationally to promote. In part, this work as African wildlife promoter constituted his post-UNESCO Director General life with UNESCO. His work as he was the first Director General of UNESCO from 1946, and this lasted a very short time, as well as did his London Zoo work. Nonetheless, despite his kind of ill-fated term as Director General, he engaged with UNESCO very closely for the rest of his life, and they engaged him, including very directed journeys to parts of Africa to try and promote the idea of wildlife conservation. So long after his short and rocky term as UNESCO's first Director General, Julian toured East, Central and South Africa. He wrote, he filmed, he lectured about endangered species. His commission journey, a very important one in 1960, produced what UNESCO called an alarming and challenging report, which is precisely what they wanted and wished for. His framework was wildlife in peril, the reduction of species, the reduction of habitat, the reduction of numbers. Well, for Julian, more explicitly than for his grandfather, most things, everything really, was political one way or another, and wildlife certainly was. He was outspoken on poaching, on the global market for animal parts. He placed Africa in a long history of global capitalism and of the abolition of its worst manifestations. He said at one point, like the slave trade, poaching is profitable, highly organised, extremely cruel, and quite ruthless. Organised poaching was one problem, but this was simply symptomatic of later changes in global capitalism, according to Julian Huxley, of which African hunger was symptomatic. He framed the dangers to wildlife in terms of human population growth continually on the planet as a whole. And population growth itself was, for Julian Huxley and his generation, primarily a geographic question, a spatial question of land and land use, as much as it was a biological one of human fertility. Humans, he said, invaded not only each other's land, creating war, a very common argument for his generation. But in his view, humans invaded the land of animals, reducing their habitat and endangering various species. And he offered slogans for the emotional and political economy of African wildlife in relation to sub-Saharan hunger. A local response to the global trade, he said, managed properly, national parks in all parts of Africa could and should yield, he said, in uppercase, profit, protein, pride, and prestige. And it's in that kind of, whether or not we think it works, it's a pithy kind of a phrase, and that's the kind of work that H.G. Wells had taught him how to use words well as a communicator when they wrote The Great Science of Life together. The other context that created a political wildlife problem for Julian Huxley was decolonisation and development, what he called the rapid emergence of African governments. Well, Julian's conception of humanity as trustee of evolution that we discussed, for those who weren't here last night, Julian Huxley's term trustee of evolution, he used as one point to describe all of humankind, being aware of the process, now aware of this magical, mysterious process of evolution. Humans, in fact, could themselves direct it. And it's my turn here to use the term trustee of evolution to describe the Huxleys themselves. But thinking about trustees, in a way, Julian's conception of humanity as trustee of evolution really, and unsurprisingly, was reserved for those who could properly appreciate the responsibility as he would have it. He didn't really mean it that all humans were equally responsible in the program of being trustees of evolution. Thus, the new role, trustees of evolution, sometimes merged with an old role, trustees of dependent people on the path to civility. Across the world, as we know, the League of Nations formal trusteeship processes were turning rapidly into institutions of development. A very direct connection. Post-war UNESCO struggled under Julian Huxley and his successors, really struggled to discard the old developmental framework of progressive stages of economic and moral civilization. Sometimes its commitment to the world's national parks and reserves signalled exactly this. So UNESCO wrote at one point, across the world, formal trusteeship processes were turning into the institutions of development. UNESCO wrote at one point, in practically every civilized country, there should be national parks. So in other words, taking on the role of being a trustee for wildlife signalled civilization, according to UNESCO. And in framing it that way, they imagined that more national parks would be installed. At other times, wildlife reserves and national parks were part of a more internationalist idea of a global commons, and Julian Huxley was certainly sat very centrally in that idea too, part of the scientific and cultural heritage of all mankind. So as far as Julian Huxley was concerned, conservationists needed to, he said, induce African governments and the African public to understand and follow an ecological model. Africans, he said, needed educational impetus and direction in this path. The new governments needed persuading that it was now or never for wildlife conservation. So really, Julian Huxley, rather more than T.H. Huxley, lived, as I've said a few times now, in this catastrophic moment. But in a way, it was his fortune, his good fortune, if I can put it that way, to do so, because it mobilized his very significant talents with words, with communication. He was able to build the kind of post-war urgency about all of these linked catastrophes very ably, for better or worse. Well, while the evolutionary framework for understanding animals and birds in the wild or in zoos or in the fields of Hertfordshire, where he undertook his work on the great crested grebe, all of this was handed to Julian by his grandfather, the political and the intellectual context that gave it meaning really could not be more different. For Thomas Henry Huxley, collecting wild animals in the empire's lands and seas, dissecting them in situ, sending them back to London, displaying them in London's museums and lecture halls. These were not extreme but complementary modes of natural history. We know retrospectively that the natural history journeys, like the HMS Rattlesnake, were a late chapter in the long modern story of ecological imperialism. Yet for TH in the late 1840s, it didn't feel like that at all. This was all a promising and an optimistic moment of global gathering. A century later, his grandson responded in a moment of global destruction. Ecological imperialism only too evident by the late 1940s. For Julian Huxley, the global wildlife commons needed protecting, the greatest threat being its own trustee. Still, it was in many ways Julian Huxley's good fortune, as I say, to live in this catastrophic era. The planetary scope of human and natural threats called for signature Huxley scale, the capacity to scale out. Atomic threats to the future, population explosions, species extinctions, natural resource depletion. Julian Huxley occupied an international communication role superbly, doing a great deal both to generate and substantiate global catastrophe and quite high-level discussion about what might be done. Well, since animals were key to both Huxley's professional worlds, it's unsurprising that the politics of human treatment of animals also defined their work. Again, to think here about their collective vital dates, 1825 to 1975, this spanned the beginning and a very high point of animal politics. The beginning being the Society for the Prevention of the Cruelty to Animals in this very earliest period, actually 1824, to animal liberation, the publication of Peter Singer's famous book, published in 1975, the year that Julian Huxley died. In his African work, Julian Huxley's trusteeship functioned on a global and international scale, as we've seen, and with respect to animals, actually at a population level and at a species level. This was large-scale politics, but it followed and drew from, of course, a long British history of guardianship of a different order, of animals on a different scale. This became most politicised expression of animal politics in the anti-vivisection movement. This was animal politics not at a population level, in fact, but the question of animal cruelty to individual organisms, individual animals with feeling, with sensation, with consciousness. So anti-vivisection, as we would know, became really a very politicised expression of animal politics, highly charged debate by the 1870s, and it moved far beyond a private ethics into public sphere politics and becoming the law of the land with the Cruelty to Animals Act 1876. T.H. Huxley was thoroughly caught up with this regulation that ultimately banned vivisection that inflicted pain on animals, but did not ban animal experimentation itself. Darwin was deeply involved, probably more involved, in the drafting of the bills, a well-known story. They worked together, they discussed drafts very closely, seeking mainly on Darwin's part to balance a deep concern about cruelty and pain with the needs for physiological experimentation. And a royal commission was established to gather perspectives, to gather evidence, and T.H. Huxley served as commissioner. And he was a wise and interesting and sensible appointment because he brought a good combined knowledge to the Royal Commission. He was, after all, trained as a doctor. He also worked as an experimental physiologist. He knew the benefits and pitfalls of experimental physiology on animals, and he also knew when experiments were unnecessary, as he saw it. The difference between what he sometimes called rational treatment, learned by experiment, and empirical treatment, learned by experience. But also, perhaps unsurprisingly, several, if not all, of the anti-vivisectionist witnesses at this Royal Commission saw Huxley as thoroughly implicated in vivisection itself, not least because of his description of vivisection in a book called Lessons in Elementary Physiology, which is 1874, which detailed vivisection. T.H. Huxley strongly, and so the Royal Commission is quite interesting because T.H. Huxley becomes almost an accused person on the stand. But so there's a whole kind of reversal. All Royal Commissions are really interesting and very useful because they're verbatim records for historians. In this case, it's quite interesting because the anti-vivisectionist witnesses, who are themselves supposedly being questioned, start to question the Commissioner, T.H. Huxley, about his implication with vivisection. T.H. himself rejected this very strongly, probably disingenuously. He rejected the implication that what he had written in his books was an endorsement of painful vivisection, even though it was a description of painful vivisection. In fact, in truth, I think that T.H. Huxley really sat on the fence with regard to vivisection. He was certainly not outspoken on cruelty to animals, as was Darwin. In the Royal Commission itself, he suggested that humans and animals had distinct pain experiences because humans anticipated it. And in this regard, he followed through a very long classical discussion about the distinction between animal instincts and human reason. He did endorse a set of principles that the British Association had approved in 1871, but I think he did so quite reluctantly, frankly. The principles were that no experiment which can be performed with an anaesthetic should be performed without it, that painful experimentation on animals is not justified simply for the purpose of demonstrating, teaching, that pain and that this is important, that painful experiment is not justified simply for the purpose of demonstrating a fact that is already known. That's the key element in that clause. And that experimentation for facts that are unknown should be performed only by very experienced and well-equipped researchers, maximising the chances of successful results. These were the premises that the British Association had agreed upon and that Huxley did put his name to, but I think he did so. But I think it was reluctant. And so from this safe position, he questioned suspect vivisectionists at the Royal Commission actually very strongly. In this way, Huxley operated far more effectively as a defender of physiology on the Royal Commission than a defender of animals. He was affronted, actually, by the anti-physiology stance of many of the anti-vivisectionist witnesses. It is all a very good read, I have to say, this Royal Commission. Over time, at least in Britain, anti-vivisectionists were probably more successful than the experimentalists or than the physiologists. There was another Royal Commission that reported in 1912, well into Julian Huxley's era, and this was, in fact, just as Julian Huxley was embarking on his own zoological career. He did undertake experimental work, Julian Huxley, mainly during his years of embryological research, and he required, because of the previous generations of work about vivisection, he was required to hold a vivisector's license to do so, and he did so. He did hold that license. But he was later held to account for carrying a vivisector's license. The fact was noted by some early objectors to his reforms as Secretary of the Zoological Gardens. So in the 1930s, the part of the politics against Julian Huxley and pressing for his removal was that he was a vivisector because he held a vivisector's license, and in fact he was a vivisector. Julian Huxley, though, responded with great publicity, very publicly surrendering his vivisector's license and banning vivisection at the London Zoo. Well, of all the animals that the Huxleys dealt with, and it was many, primates were, of course, core Huxley business. T.H. and Julian's appreciation of simians stretched from the wild to the captive, the historical to the filmic. Julian Huxley's experience alone traversed his custodianship of individual gorillas held at the London Zoo, of Moina Mosisa and Mock, held there between 1932 and 1938. It covered his very adventurous journeys into the Congo mountains, and his research engagement with key primatologists of the later 20th century, including Jane Goodall. And it reminds me that in the wonderful papers, the Julian Huxley papers at Rice University, there's a very close exchange between the very young Jane Goodall and the elderly Julian Huxley, just as there's interesting, by the by, letters between David Attenborough and Julian Huxley. Julian Huxley came to value primates in their original habitats, often their Central African habitats. He could describe, for example, Ugandan vis-a-vis Belgian, Congo protection of mountain gorillas with considerable legitimacy. He was on the ground with repeat visits over many years. But his grandfather, however, found both Africa and apes mainly in the British Library. T.H. Huxley worked through others' observations of Africa and apes, not his own. And the foundation of T.H. Huxley's 1863 essay on the natural history of the man-like apes is really not a study in the genre of natural history at all. It's really a kind of history of science, actually. It was a text-based human history of early modern European travel to Africa and their encounters with and observations of a range of primates. T.H. Huxley researched and wrote about man-like apes, what he called man-like apes, historically, really as a historian. He looked at Pigafetta's early modern accounts, for example, itself drawn from a Portuguese mariner's notes and published in 1598. He also drew from, this is a woodcut from that essay on the natural history of man-like apes. T.H. Huxley also drew from accounts of an Englishman who lived in the woods in the Kingdom of Congo for 9 months, and another Englishman who had lived in Angola for nearly 18 years in the early 17th century. The latter described animals in a way that completely engrossed and intrigued T.H. Huxley. Early 17th century accounts of animals hairy all over, otherwise altogether like men and women in their whole bodily shape. For Huxley and his readers, the deepest question actually, I think, was less physical resemblance to humans than a blow-by-blow account of other primates' social behaviour and evidence of communication, this question of language. Are animals really dumb? His generation was steeped in a long-standing literature about animals' capacity for language and therefore reason, and apes' potential actually. This was a live question. Apes' potential to communicate with humans, possibly with a spoken language, if brought into civilization, if brought into some kind of civility? Was language solely human, or might it have evolved from animal noises? Huxley was unimpressed with Linnaeus's accounts of African or Asian man-like apes, but the great taxonomist did recognise a third species of man, well before T.H. Huxley, of course, which interested T.H. Huxley greatly. By the time of Linnaeus's work, individual actual chimpanzees, gibbons, some orangutans were being brought to Europe from Africa and from the East Indies, and naturalists by Linnaeus's time were able to examine living animals directly. But they were very singular and very rare, and their significance for that era's key naturalists arose as much from long-standing and repeated examination of prized skeletons as observation of actual animals in life. And the provenance of these skeletons, their relation to the text-based and sometimes philological accounts of particular animals' brutal capture and transportation, is partly what T.H. Huxley sought to establish in his essay. Finally, and very recently, almost up to date for T.H. Huxley, the Americans Thomas Savage and Jeffries Wyman had stumbled across and then examined not an actual gorilla, but a skull of a massive ape, they said, at the Gaboon River. And in 1847, Savage had renamed it the gorilla, had invented the term gorilla. And that was only 1847. And by 1863, a very short time later, when Huxley wrote his essay, already T.H. Huxley could presume that his readers knew this term. In fact, he called the term gorilla its present well-known appellation. So this term gorilla just took off immediately. Nonetheless, even when Huxley is writing so importantly about gorillas, only skeletons had arrived to be analysed by European anatomists, and it was still travellers and missionaries like these Americans alone who sent back accounts of the great apes' behaviours and habits in life. So Huxley very pithily actually wrote that the gorilla was, he said, the first to be made known to the general world and the last to be scientifically investigated. In many ways, searching for man-like apes was actually a fairly conventional and long-standing way to document simians. They'd long been comprehended as man-like, at least as early as scholastic descriptions of the ape as degenerate and monstrous man. Fallen from grace was the scholastic argument. Apes actually, in T.H. Huxley's era, could fairly easily be imagined as man-like. They had been for a long time. But could humans be imagined as ape-like? That, of course, was Huxley's great public challenge and one that he relished. What T.H. Huxley called anthropene, or the man family, was a well-defined group of primates between which and the next group were very clear anatomical distinctions. Despite these distinctions, he was insistent that an evolutionary sequence representing what he called the closest of ties was visible. This claim, of course, became intimately tied to Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. But Huxley didn't need Darwin to come to this conclusion. Actually, he ended up agreeing with Linnaeus's old classification that, quote, man is a member of the same order of the apes, primates. Now, the racism within T.H. Huxley's comprehension of the man family is very clear and very well documented. He certainly deployed in what he called the man family a schema of higher and lower humans, and the critique that is very well known and very extensive of that obviously stands. Nonetheless, I think it's useful also to be quite clear on what T.H. Huxley himself was aiming to know and show in his accumulation and study of comparative skeletal remains of primates. Human variation in the present was not in and of itself T.H. Huxley's object of inquiry. It's not really what he was interested in. Instead, it was necessary data for him, on his own terms, to enable claims to be made about human-ape evolutionary transitions and current distinctions. So Huxley shifted back and forth between inter- and intra-species difference, with most focus by far on search for evidence of ancient, that is, evolutionary links between humans and so-called man-like apes. And here again he inclined towards the past, not the present or the future. His essays and his images specified Australian, Negro, Tartar or ancient Danish crania, and with skulls known or presumed to be ancient. Their purpose for him was to differentiate the man family from other primates, not to conflate them. And this is how I think we should read this much reproduced image from Huxley's essay on the relations of man to lower animals, often analysed in decades of critique of Darwinist biological anthropology. For T.H. Huxley, the Australian skull was in this sequence, what he called the Australian skull, was in this sequence precisely because it represented the man family. That's why it's there. The point in the text accompanying this, and in its multiple reproductions, the text and the image are separated out, but good historians need to put these things together. The point in the text was to show that the differences between man and various apes, T.H. Huxley said, are truly immense. He concluded that at this point in time, in his point in time, he said there is no existing link between man and the gorilla, by which he meant that the search for fossil evidence of an ancient evolutionary link was ongoing. The sequence here represents the two kinds of difference being discussed at once. The difference between man and other primates in the present, which Thomas Henry Huxley's comparative anatomy always led him to explain and defend. He was delineating the man family from other families of primates. So on the one hand, that's what it means. On the other hand, he was communicating what ethnology, that is the study of human difference within the present day, his present day man family, might yield about ancient man. The antiquity of man in evolutionary time actually was his primary interest. Determining man's place in nature was perhaps the key and enduring Huxley project. In this regard, both T.H. Huxley and Julian ran counter perhaps to the great modern drive to distinguish humans from animals, culture from nature, a drive that historian Joanna Burke, has shown runs through philosophy, science, theology, art for most of the last 200 years. What does it mean to be human? The title of her book. Where does humanity end and animal begin? The questions and the constant attempts to settle these questions, Joanna Burke argues, indicate that the boundaries between human and animal are ultimately entwined and indistinguishable. Yet even as the Huxleys both insisted on the animal constitution of humankind, humans and apes had a common ancestor, they also both insisted on human-animal distinction. T.H. Huxley's work was to demarcate the man family. And while Julian Huxley insisted that evolution acted on everybody, everything, and always, it was only humans who could understand the process. Both T.H. and Julian Huxley, it turns out, were quite conventional in their dedication to human specialness. Joanna Burke suggests that Darwinian arguments, she writes, may have contributed to the deconstruction of the radical differences imagined between humans and animals. But humanism, she writes, survived this attack. And in a way, this is precisely where the Huxleys sat, performing this dual work of modernity. They did an enormous amount to work towards the deconstruction of human-animal distinctions, and they developed humanism for the modern world, been built precisely on this idea of the unique human consciousness. So having then set out the Huxleys and their ideas on cosmologies, and in this lecture ventured into the world of animals of all kinds and and in all kinds of captivity and wild, dead and alive states, what I want to do in my lecture tomorrow night is in fact to turn more fully and completely to this question of the Huxleys and their thoughts on humans. What Thomas Henry Huxley nominated as the biological man family, Julian Huxley, his grandson, pursued as the cultural family of man, that precarious project of high modernity. That tomorrow evening. Thank you.